What if every Greek god, monster, and hero belonged to one long connected timeline? Welcome to Sleepy Hidden History. Tonight, we'll journey from the birth of the cosmos and rise of Zeus to Heracles, Achilles, the fall of Troy, and Odysseus's final return. Before we begin, tell me which city you're listening from. And if you enjoy the journey, please like and subscribe. It may seem small, but it means a great deal to me. Thank you so much. Before there was a Mount Olympus, before Zeus held a thunderbolt, and before human beings imagined that the gods were watching from above, the Greek story of existence began in a place with no cities, no oceans, and no sky. It began with chaos. The word is often understood today as disorder, but in Hesiod's Theogony, composed around the late 8th or early 7th century BCE, chaos was closer to a vast opening, a yawning gap where the familiar structure of the world did not yet exist. Hesiod was not writing science in the modern sense, nor was he recording an event witnessed by anyone. He was preserving and shaping an ancient attempt to answer a question that every civilization eventually confronts. If the world now has order, what existed before that order began? Out of this first emptiness came Gaia, the earth, solid and enduring beneath everything that would follow. Tartarus also appeared, a remote and shadowed depth beneath the world, along with Eros, the force of attraction and generation that allowed separate beings to create new life. From chaos emerged Erebus, associated with deep darkness, and Nyx, the night. From their union came Ether, the bright upper air, and Hemera, the day. Darkness had produced light, and night had produced its opposite. This was not creation by a single all-powerful maker. The Greek cosmos unfolded through generations, as one force gave rise to another, and the empty universe slowly filled itself with relationships. Gaia then brought forth Uranus, the starry sky, high enough to cover her completely. She also produced the mountains and Pontus, the sea, before joining with Uranus to begin the first great divine family. Their children were the Titans, 12 ancient powers whose names would echo through nearly every later stage of Greek mythology. Oceanus, Coeus, Crius, Hyperion, Iapetus, and the youngest, Cronus, along with Thea, Rhea, Themis, Mnemosyne, Phoebe, and Tethys. They were not originally a simple army of villains. Each represented a dimension of the world the Greeks were trying to understand. Oceanus was imagined as the enormous river surrounding the inhabited earth. Hyperion became connected with heavenly light and would father Helios, Selene, and Eos, the sun, moon, and dawn. Mnemosyne embodied memory, without which no oral culture could preserve its past. Themis represented divine order and established custom, while Iapetus became the ancestor of Prometheus and a branch of the family deeply connected to the future of humanity. The Titans belonged to an older cosmos, but older did not mean evil. Later art and popular retellings would sometimes blend them together with the giants or portray them as enormous monsters, yet early Greek tradition presents them more subtly. They were the first ruling generation, powerful enough to shape reality, but still vulnerable to fear, rivalry, and time. Gaia and Uranus also produced 3 Cyclopes, Brontes, Steropes, and Argus, whose names evoked thunder, lightning, and brightness. These were not yet the wandering, shepherd-like Cyclops encountered in Homer's Odyssey. Hesiod's Cyclops were primordial beings associated with extraordinary craftsmanship, and their skills would later change the balance of power among the gods. Last came Cottus, Briareus, and Gyges, the 3 Hecatoncheires, beings imagined with 100 hands and 50 heads each. Such impossible bodies were not meant as biological descriptions. They gave form to forces too overwhelming to picture in ordinary human terms, as though storms, earthquakes, and the raw violence of nature had briefly taken on living shapes. Uranus feared and hated some of these children, especially those whose power seemed least controllable. Rather than allow them to take their place in the world, he forced them back into Gaia's hidden depths. The earth, which had created them, became their prison. That detail turns the birth of the cosmos into something more than a peaceful sequence of generations. The first family in existence was already divided between a ruler determined to preserve control and a mother carrying the weight of everything he refused to face. Gaia finally formed a jagged sickle from an unbreakable substance and appealed to her Titan children. Most were frightened into silence. Only Cronus answered. Hesiod calls him clever and cunning, qualities that would define his rise as much as physical strength. Gaia concealed him until Uranus descended over the earth, and then Cronus struck, separating sky from earth and ending his father's absolute rule. The ancient account is violent, but its deeper meaning lies in what changed afterward. Sky and earth, once pressed together, were now divided. Space opened between them. The Titans could emerge, and the world gained the vertical structure the Greeks recognized. The ground below, the heavens above, and a living realm between them. Yet creation carried the memory of conflict. From the aftermath came the Erinyes, powers associated with punishing crimes within families, as well as the giants and the Meliae, nymphs of the ash trees. Far away in the sea, foam gathered around another emerging figure, Aphrodite. In Hesiod's version, the goddess of desire was therefore older than Zeus and most of the Olympians. Homeric tradition offers a different genealogy, identifying her as a daughter of Zeus and Dione. The contradiction is not a mistake that can be corrected by choosing whichever version seems more familiar. Greek mythology had no single sacred book or central authority enforcing one official timeline. Stories changed as they traveled between islands, cities, sanctuaries, poets, and generations, and different communities preserved different memories of the same divine figures. That is why a chronological history of Greek mythology must remain a reconstruction, a careful path through traditions that overlap but do not always agree. What can be examined historically is the world in which those traditions developed. Centuries before Hesiod, Mycenaean palace administrators wrote the earliest known form of Greek on clay tablets using a script called Linear B. Those tablets, dating mainly from the 2nd millennium BCE, contain names connected with several later Greek gods, including Zeus, Poseidon, Hera, and Dionysus. But they do not preserve this complete creation story. They are mostly administrative records, offerings, livestock, land, workers, and goods moving through palace economies. After the collapse of the Mycenaean palace system around the end of the Bronze Age, the Linear B writing tradition disappeared. The stories continued largely through oral performance until Greek alphabetic writing emerged centuries later. By the time Hesiod organized the genealogy of the gods into poetry, generations of singers had already reshaped the material. His theogony may preserve very old Greek ideas, influences acquired through contact with neighboring cultures, and innovations introduced by poets whose names are now lost. Scholars have long noticed similarities between the Greek succession myth and older traditions from Anatolia and the Near East, where one generation of gods also overthrows another. The Hurrian and Hittite story associated with Kumarbi is especially striking in its pattern of divine fathers being displaced by younger challengers. These parallels do not prove that the Greeks simply copied one foreign tale. The Eastern Mediterranean was a connected world of merchants, migrants, sailors, diplomats, and storytellers. Motifs could cross borders, then be altered until they belonged fully to the culture retelling them. Greek mythology grew in that shared environment, absorbing outside patterns while giving them Greek landscapes, Greek names, and distinctly Greek anxieties about fate and power. Cronus now stood at the center of the new order. Later tradition would remember his reign as a distant golden age, a time before the burdens of ordinary human life. Although Hesiod's accounts of divine succession and human ages do not fit together as neatly as later summaries sometimes suggest. More importantly, Cronus had not ended the cycle that began with Uranus. He had demonstrated how the cycle worked. A ruler feared his children, tried to prevent change, and created the very rebellion that removed him. Cronus had won because his father could not imagine sharing the world with a younger generation. Yet victory did not make Cronus more trusting. Some of the most dangerous primordial beings remained confined, and the new ruler carried the knowledge that power could pass from parent to child with terrifying speed. Gaia and Uranus warned that his own future would mirror the past. One of his children was destined to overthrow him. The prophecy did not tell Cronus when it would happen or which child would rise against him. It only transformed every birth into a possible threat. When Cronus chose his sister Rhea as queen, the first Titan dynasty appeared secure, stretching across a newly open cosmos beneath the stars. But beneath that calm surface, the next generation was already approaching. Rhea would give birth to gods whose names would define the Greek world, and Cronus, once the courageous son who challenged a fearful father, would now reveal what he was willing to do to keep his father's fate from becoming his own. The moment Rhea's first child entered the world, Cronus acted before the newborn could ever threaten him. Hestia disappeared into her father, and the same fate followed Demeter, Hera, Hades, and Poseidon, each taken away as soon as Rhea gave birth. In the logic of myth, Cronus believed he had found a perfect defense against prophecy. If none of his children could grow, none could become his rival. Yet his solution exposed the weakness beneath his power. A truly secure ruler would not need to fear an infant, and with every child he removed, Cronus made rebellion less avoidable rather than more distant. Rhea endured 5 losses in silence, but when she was expecting her 6th child, she sought the help of Gaia and Uranus. The old powers who had predicted Cronus's downfall now designed the plan that would bring it closer. They instructed Rhea to travel to Crete, where she could give birth beyond Cronus's watch. Hesiod connects the event with the region around Lyctus, while later traditions placed the hidden child in caves associated with Mount Ida or Mount Dicta. Other Greek communities claimed that Zeus had been born in Arcadia instead, revealing how sacred geography could reshape a myth. Cities and sanctuaries did not always compete by rejecting the same god. Sometimes they competed by claiming that the god's story had happened on their own land. Rhea named the child Zeus and concealed him in a cave, then returned to Cronus carrying a stone wrapped like a newborn. Cronus accepted it and swallowed it without examining what he had been given. The ruler who thought he understood the future was defeated for the first time by an object from the earth beneath his feet. Around the hidden Zeus, later storytellers gathered a protective world of nymphs, sacred animals, and armed guardians. Some said a goat named Amalthea fed him, though other versions described Amalthea as a nymph rather than an animal. The Curetes, young warriors associated with Crete, were said to have struck their shields together so that Cronus could not hear the child crying. These details do not all appear in Hesiod, and they probably accumulated over centuries as local ritual, landscape, and poetry became attached to Zeus's childhood. What remains constant is the central idea. The future king of the cosmos began not on a throne, but in concealment, dependent on beings whom the reigning king considered too unimportant to notice. Zeus grew with a knowledge his father never possessed. Cronus had risen through a single decisive attack, but Zeus would rise by building alliances. When the time came to confront the Titan King, the ancient sources offer more than one version of how he freed his siblings. Hesiod credits the cunning advice of Gaia, while a later tradition gives an important role to Metis, a goddess associated with intelligent strategy. In that account, Metis prepared a substance that forced Cronus to release what he had swallowed. The stone came out first, followed by Poseidon, Hades, Hera, Demeter, and Hestia, alive and now fully prepared to oppose him. Zeus later placed the stone at Pytho, the site that would become Delphi, as a lasting sign of how deception had broken Cronus's control. The sacred stone shown at Delphi in historical times cannot prove that such an event occurred, but it demonstrates how myth could be anchored to a physical object, allowing worshippers to stand before something they believed belonged to the beginning of divine history. The newly freed gods were powerful, but they were not yet strong enough to defeat the Titans. The struggle that followed, known as the Titanomachy, lasted 10 years according to Hesiod. Later tradition imagined the younger gods commanding from Mount Olympus, while the Titans held Mount Othrys farther south. This was not simply a war between one species of deity and another. The dividing lines ran through the older generation itself. Oceanus does not appear as an enemy defeated in the final battle, while Themis and Mnemosyne would later hold honored places within Zeus's order. Prometheus, a son of the Titan Oedipus, was remembered in some traditions as supporting Zeus, or at least refusing to stand with Cronus. The conflict was therefore a civil war within a divine family, shaped by loyalties, predictions, and calculations about which side represented the future. For 10 years, neither generation could secure victory. That stalemate ended only when Gaia advised Zeus to release the Cyclops and Hecatoncheires, the ancient beings still confined beneath the world. Zeus gave them nectar and ambrosia, treating former prisoners as allies rather than disposable weapons. In return, the Cyclops provided the tools that would define the three ruling brothers. Zeus received thunder and lightning. Later traditions gave Poseidon the trident and Hades a helmet that concealed its wearer from sight. The Hecatoncheires brought a different kind of power, overwhelming force capable of breaking the Titan defenses. Hesiod describes the final battle on a scale larger than any human war. The sea seemed to roar, the earth shook, the sky groaned, and the blazing thunderbolts of Zeus turned the battlefield into a vision of nature itself coming apart. The Hecatoncheires released a vast storm of stones against the Titans, while Zeus advanced through fire, smoke, and thunder. This is poetry, not an eyewitness record of a prehistoric conflict, but that does not make it meaningless. By turning earthquakes, storms, and the movement of mountains into a war among living powers, the story gave ancient audiences a way to imagine why the world could feel stable for generations and then suddenly become violent. Victory finally went to Zeus and his allies. The defeated Titans who had fought against him were sent to Tartarus, described as being as far beneath the earth as the sky stood above it. Hesiod imagines a bronze enclosure surrounded by darkness, with the Hecatoncheires serving as guards. Atlas, the son of Iapetus, received a different burden at the western edge of the world. He was made to hold up the sky. Later images often show Atlas carrying the earth, but early Greek tradition places the heavens on his shoulders, maintaining the separation that allowed the inhabited world to exist. Cronus's ultimate fate varies. Hesiod places the defeated Titan generation in Tartarus, while later religious and poetic traditions sometimes imagine Cronus ruling over the Isles of the Blessed. The difference reflects a deeper tension in his character. He could be remembered as the fearful ruler who tried to stop time, yet also as the king of a lost age when human life was supposedly easier. Greek mythology rarely preserved important figures in only one moral color. A god could be both dangerous and revered, defeated and still sacred, depending on the place, period, and purpose of the story. Even after the Titans fell, Zeus's rule was not guaranteed. Gaia now brought forth Typhon, fathered by Tartarus in Hesiod's account, a storm being so immense and strange that ordinary anatomy could not contain him. From his shoulders rose serpentine forms, and from his many voices came sounds associated with gods, animals, and the untamed world. The image is less a portrait of a creature than an attempt to give shape to uncontrolled catastrophe. Typhon challenged Zeus at the moment when the new cosmic order was still fragile. Some later accounts temporarily place Zeus in serious danger, but Hesiod presents the conflict as a demonstration that the new king has reached his full power. Zeus attacked with thunder, lightning, and relentless fire until Typhon was defeated and cast into Tartarus. Ancient and later writers connected Typhon with destructive winds and volcanic landscapes, especially the region around Mount Etna. Such associations should not be treated as coded scientific reports of one identifiable eruption. They show something more cautious and historically believable. People living near violent natural features used myth to give those places memory, personality, and meaning. Another conflict, the Gigantomachy, was later woven into the story of Olympian rule. In it, the giants challenged the gods and could be defeated only with help from a mortal hero, Heracles. Because Heracles belonged to a much later heroic generation, the episode does not fit neatly into a simple timeline. Its importance grew through poetry and art, especially as Greek communities used the victory of order over the giants as a symbol of stability overcoming chaos. The myth's shifting position is a reminder that Greek chronology was assembled backward as often as it was carried forward. Storytellers connected famous characters across generations because meaning mattered more to them than an exact calendar. With the greatest challengers removed, Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades divided authority. In the division described most clearly in Homeric tradition, Zeus received the sky, Poseidon the sea, and Hades the underworld, while the earth and Olympus remained shared. Hades was therefore not the Greek equivalent of an evil devil, nor was he normally counted among the 12 gods living on Olympus. He was the stern ruler of the dead, governing a necessary part of the cosmos from below. Poseidon controlled the sea, but also carried associations with earthquakes and horses. Zeus held the sky and occupied the highest position, yet his kingship depended on more than possession of the thunderbolt. He maintained power by assigning honors, recognizing useful allies, enforcing oaths, and preventing any single force from overwhelming the rest. It was not equality, and it was not democracy, but it was a broader settlement than the closed rule of Cronus. The gods who supported Zeus received places within the new system, while many older powers were absorbed rather than erased. This may explain why the Olympian order proved more durable than the dynasties before it. Zeus did not attempt to become the entire universe by himself. Still, the peace above the world concealed the next dispute. The divine war had established who would govern creation, but it had not decided what place mortal beings would occupy within it. Among the surviving children of Oedipus stood Prometheus, observant, calculating, and increasingly interested in the fragile creatures living far below Olympus. Zeus had defeated the strength of the Titans and the fury of Typhon, yet the next challenge to his authority would begin not with an army or a mountain-shaking monster, but with a clever argument over sacrifice, a hidden flame, and the uncertain future of humankind. Prometheus did not challenge Zeus with an army. He challenged him with a question. What portion of the new world would belong to the gods, and what portion would be left to mortals? As a son of the Titan Iapetus, Prometheus belonged to the older divine generation, but he had avoided the fate of the Titans who fought against Zeus. His name was understood by the Greeks as suggesting forethought, while his brother Epimetheus represented the dangerous habit of understanding consequences only after they arrived. That contrast would shape everything that followed. Later writers claim that Prometheus formed human beings from clay, sometimes with Athena breathing life into them, but this familiar image is not clearly presented in Hesiod's earliest surviving account. In the Theogony and Works and Days, humanity already exists when Prometheus begins negotiating its relationship with Zeus. That distinction matters because there was never one universally accepted Greek story of human creation. Some traditions imagined people emerging from earth. Others connected particular communities to stones, trees, or divine ancestors. And still others focused less on how human bodies appeared than on why human life became difficult. Hesiod's answer begins at Mekone, a place later identified with Sicyon, where gods and mortals gathered to determine the rules of sacrifice. Prometheus prepared an ox and separated it into 2 portions. In one pile, he concealed the edible meat beneath an unappealing covering. In the other, he arranged the bones beneath a shining layer of fat, making the lesser portion appear more desirable. He then invited Zeus to choose. Hesiod says Zeus understood the trick, although the poem leaves room for debate over whether he knowingly accepted the deceptive portion so that he would have a reason to punish humanity. Zeus chose the bones and fat, establishing the pattern that Greek worshippers would later recognize. The gods received the smoke rising from the altar, while human participants consumed much of the meat. The story did more than explain a ritual. It defined the distance between immortals and mortals. Human beings could share a feast with the gods, but they could not sit at the same table as equals. The smoke traveled upward, the food remained below. Angered by Prometheus, Zeus withheld fire from humanity, turning the dispute over sacrifice into a struggle over survival and technology. Prometheus responded by stealing a living flame and concealing it inside the hollow stalk of a giant fennel plant. The detail is remarkably practical. Dry fennel pith can preserve a slow-burning ember, making it possible to transport fire without carrying an open blaze. That does not transform the myth into a historical report, but it grounds the theft in an object familiar to people who had actually moved fire across long distances. When Prometheus returned the flame, the night below Olympus changed. Fire meant warmth against winter, protection in darkness, cooked food, hardened pottery, and eventually the high temperatures required for metalworking. Archaeology shows that human control of fire began vastly earlier than Greek civilization, so Prometheus cannot be treated as a memory of its literal discovery. For an ancient audience, however, fire represented the difference between merely existing in nature and actively reshaping it. That is why the theft was so threatening. Prometheus had not simply taken one possession from Zeus. He had given mortals the ability to transform raw material, extend their reach, and build a world of their own. Zeus punished Prometheus by binding him in a distant place where a great bird returned to torment him each day. A sentence later ended through the intervention of Heracles. Yet Zeus also prepared a consequence for humanity, and this part of the story reveals far more about the society that preserved it than about the actual origin of women. He ordered Hephaestus to shape a young woman from earth and water. Athena taught her skilled work and dressed her. Aphrodite gave her charm. The graces and the seasons adorned her. Hermes contributed persuasive speech and a calculating mind. Because the gods each gave her something, she was called Pandora, commonly interpreted as all-gifted, though the name may also carry older religious meanings connected with a goddess who gives all things. Hesiod presents her beauty as part of the danger, reflecting the anxieties of a strongly patriarchal society in which marriage, inheritance, household labor, and control over family property were deeply connected. The poem's suspicion toward the first woman should therefore be read as evidence of archaic Greek attitudes, not as a timeless judgment about women. Pandora was brought to Epimetheus, who had been warned by Prometheus never to accept a gift from Zeus. He accepted her anyway, and only afterward recognized the trap hidden inside the offering. What happened next is one of the most famous moments in Greek mythology, yet it is usually pictured incorrectly. Pandora did not open a small box. The Greek text describes a pithos, a large storage jar used for grain, oil, wine, or even burials. The box entered European tradition much later, probably through a Renaissance translation that replaced the jar with a different kind of container. When Pandora removed its lid, the forces that made human existence painful escaped into the world. Disease, exhausting labor, grief, and countless troubles that could move silently among people. Only Elpis, usually translated as hope, remained beneath the rim when the jar was closed. Even that ending refuses to settle into a simple message. If hope remained safely inside, perhaps humanity retained one defense against suffering. But if the jar was a prison, hope may have been withheld while every other burden escaped. Ancient Greek does not resolve the ambiguity for us, and the uncertainty may be the point. Hope can preserve people through hardship, but it can also keep them waiting for a future that never arrives. Hesiod's human world was built around that tension. Mortals understood enough to imagine a better life, yet never enough to control fate completely. He expanded this vision through the story of 5 successive human ages. The first was the Golden Age, created during the reign of Cronus. Its people lived without exhausting labor, and the earth provided what they needed freely. When that generation passed away, they became benevolent spirits watching over mortal life. The Silver Age followed, populated by people who remained children for an unusually long time, but became reckless and disrespectful when they finally matured. Zeus removed them, and another generation took their place. The Bronze Age was harsher, filled with powerful people devoted to conflict, their tools, houses, and weapons imagined through the metal that named them. Their own violence brought their age to an end, and they passed anonymously into the shadowed realm of Hades. At this point, the expected decline from gold to silver to bronze suddenly breaks. Hesiod inserts a 4th generation that is not named after a metal, the Age of Heroes. These were the figures associated with Thebes and Troy, people greater than ordinary mortals, but still capable of error, loss, and death. Some were said to reach the Isles of the Blessed, where they lived under Cronus at the edge of the world. Only after them came the Iron Age, the troubled present in which Hesiod believed he was living. Work was endless, justice uncertain, families divided, and trust increasingly fragile. His sequence should not be confused with the archaeological system of Stone, Bronze, and Iron Ages used by modern historians. Hesiod was constructing a moral history, not a scientific timeline of metallurgy. Gold, silver, bronze, and iron measured the changing quality of human life as he imagined it, while the inserted heroic generation connected his vision with the great stories already circulating among Greek singers. Another tradition explained humanity's renewal through a devastating flood. In versions preserved by writers such as Pindar, Apollodorus, and later the Roman poet Ovid, Zeus decided that a corrupt human generation could no longer continue. Prometheus warned his son Deucalion, who survived with his wife Pyrrha inside a wooden chest or vessel until the waters receded and they reached high ground, often identified with Mount Parnassus. Finding the land silent and nearly empty, they sought guidance from the divine power Themis. They were told to cast the bones of their mother behind them. The command sounded disturbing until Deucalion understood that the mother was Gaia, the earth, and her bones were stones. The stones thrown by Deucalion became men, while those thrown by Pyrrha became women, giving the renewed human race a symbolic connection to the endurance of rock. Flood stories appear in many ancient cultures, especially across Mesopotamia and the Eastern Mediterranean, and contact between societies may have helped certain story patterns travel. Severe regional floods could also have contributed to collective memory. But there is no scientific evidence that the Greek account records a single worldwide flood exactly as described, and similarities between traditions do not prove they all preserve one event. What these stories share is a fear that civilization can vanish faster than it was built, leaving survivors to recover not only homes and fields, but the rules that make society possible. The human world now had fire, sacrifice, labor, sickness, uncertain hope, and memories of entire generations disappearing. It also had agriculture, whose yearly cycle was explained through Demeter's grief over the absence of Persephone and her joy when her daughter returned, binding mortal survival to the changing seasons. The gods had not created a world free from suffering. They had created one in which every gift carried a cost, and every harvest depended on forces beyond human control. Yet this difficult world also produced something Olympus could not manufacture on command: mortal courage. Across Argos, Thebes, Crete, and lands beyond the Aegean, divine blood began to mingle with human family lines. Strange creatures guarded distant roads, kings received warnings they misunderstood, and children were born beneath prophecies that would shape entire dynasties. The age of humanity had begun, but waiting just beyond its first uncertain dawn was the age of heroes. The first heroes did not enter a world waiting to celebrate them. They were born into families already burdened by prophecies, rival claims to thrones, and memories of offenses that could outlive the people who committed them. Among the earliest and most influential of these figures was Perseus, whose story began in Argos, with King Achilles asking an oracle whether he would ever have a male heir. The answer offered no comfort. He would have no son, and a future grandson would bring about his death. Achilles tried to prevent that future by isolating his daughter Danae inside a guarded chamber, but prophecy in Greek mythology rarely fails because someone ignores it. More often, it succeeds because someone becomes obsessed with escaping it. Zeus reached Danae in the form of a shower of gold, and she later gave birth to Perseus. When Achilles discovered the child, he refused to kill them directly, perhaps fearing divine punishment, and instead sealed Danae and Perseus inside a wooden chest and set it upon the sea. The waves carried them to the island of Seriphus, where a fisherman named Dictys found them and raised Perseus. This quiet rescue established an important pattern in heroic mythology. Kings often attempt to erase a dangerous child, while ordinary people preserve the life that will change kingdoms. Years later, Dictys's brother Polydectes, ruler of the island, devised a plan to remove the now-grown Perseus. He demanded gifts of horses from his companions, knowing Perseus had none to offer, and accepted the young man's reckless promise to bring back something far more dangerous: the head of Medusa. The Gorgons lived beyond the familiar edges of the Greek world, and of the three sisters, only Medusa was mortal. Early Greek tradition does not give one simple explanation for how she became a Gorgon. The popular story that Athena transformed Medusa after an offense in her temple comes most clearly from the much later Roman poet Ovid, and should not be treated as the only or earliest Greek version. In archaic Greek art, Medusa often appears as a terrifying guardian figure with a wide face, staring eyes, and serpentine features designed to repel danger. Images of her head, known as Gorgonea, appeared on shields, temples, armor, and household objects. The very sight believed to destroy an enemy could also be used as protection, turning fear itself into a defense. Perseus could not succeed by courage alone, because looking directly at Medusa would turn him to stone. Athena and Hermes guided him, but he first had to find the Graeae, three ancient sisters who shared a single eye and knew the road to the Gorgons. By taking control of their shared sight, Perseus forced them to reveal the way. Divine helpers then provided the equipment his task required: winged sandals for rapid travel. A special bag called a kibis is to contain what he carried, and the helmet of Hades, which made its wearer unseen. Hermes gave him a curved blade, while Athena supplied the most important tool of all, a polished shield. Approaching Medusa through her reflection, Perseus avoided the direct gaze that had defeated others and struck while she slept. From the aftermath emerged Pegasus, the winged horse, and Chrysaor, both linked in Hesiod's genealogy to Poseidon and Medusa. Perseus placed Medusa's head inside the protective bag and escaped as her immortal sisters pursued him, hidden beneath Hades' helmet. The victory was not presented as proof that Perseus was stronger than every monster. He survived because he listened, prepared, and used each gift for its precise purpose. Greek heroes often appeared physically extraordinary, but their most revealing encounters were tests of whether they could recognize the limits of strength. On his journey home, Perseus reached the distant land the Greeks called Ethiopia, a term used broadly for peoples imagined far to the south or east, and not a precise reference to the borders of the modern nation of Ethiopia. There he found Andromeda, daughter of King Cepheus and Queen Cassiopeia, left exposed as an offering to a sea creature after her mother's pride had angered divine powers. Perseus agreed to rescue her, overcame the creature, and later married her. Their story connected the hero of Argos with a world far beyond mainland Greece, reflecting how Greek imaginations stretched across seas traveled by merchants and sailors. Ancient vase painters repeatedly returned to the scene, sometimes depicting clothing, objects, or facial features drawn from their own period rather than any lost heroic age. Myth was never preserved like a photograph. Every retelling quietly dressed the past in something the present could recognize. When Perseus returned to Seriphus, he found that Polydectes had continued to threaten Danae and Dictys. Perseus entered the king's gathering and revealed Medusa's head, turning Polydectes and his supporters to stone. He then placed Dictys on the throne and returned the divine objects he had borrowed. Athena kept Medusa's head upon her aegis or shield, transforming the defeated monster into an enduring symbol of divine protection. Perseus finally traveled back toward Argos, but Acrisius fled rather than face the grandson he had feared for so long. Distance could not defeat the oracle. During athletic games in Thessaly, according to the best-known version, Perseus threw a discus that accidentally struck Acrisius, fulfilling the prophecy without intention or hatred. The story's logic is exact and unsettling. Acrisius's precaution saved him from a deliberate attack, yet they could not protect him from chance. Ashamed to inherit Argos after the accident, Perseus exchanged kingdoms with his relative Megapenthes and became associated with Tiryns and, in later tradition, the founding or fortification of Mycenae. Archaeology confirms that Mycenae and Tiryns were major centers of late Bronze Age Greece, with massive walls, palace complexes, storerooms, tombs, and networks extending across the Mediterranean. It does not confirm that Perseus founded either city. The monumental remains were already ancient when many surviving versions of his story took shape. Later Greeks looked at walls built from stones so large that ordinary labor seemed insufficient and credited them to cyclopes or heroic kings. Perseus gave Mycenae a meaningful ancestral founder, connecting a visible, ruined landscape to a family line that audiences could remember. Another early hero, Bellerophon, belonged to a different branch of the mythic world, but faced a similar test. How could a mortal approach something impossible without being destroyed by success? His story was already old when the Iliad reached its surviving form. In Book 6, the Trojan ally Glaucus recounts Bellerophon's history, making it one of the earliest hero tales preserved inside Homeric epic. Bellerophon was associated with Corinth, then known as Ephyra, and was commonly called the son of Glaucus, although some traditions gave him divine descent from Poseidon. After an accidental killing forced him into exile, he sought purification at the court of King Proetus of Tiryns. The queen, called Antea by Homer and Sthenoboia in later sources, made a false accusation against him after he rejected her attention. Proetus did not punish his guest directly because the customs of hospitality and purification placed Bellerophon under his protection. Instead, he sent him to King Iobates in Lycia, carrying a sealed message requesting that its bearer be removed. The written message is especially interesting because the tale imagines writing within the heroic age, although the Greek alphabet used by Homer's audiences developed centuries after the collapse of the Mycenaean palaces. The detail may preserve a vague memory that signs could carry authority, or it may simply reflect a later storyteller placing familiar practices into an imagined past. Iobates first welcomed Bellerophon as a guest and only read the message after several days. Unwilling to violate hospitality himself, he assigned the newcomer a series of tasks expected to be fatal. The first was to defeat the Chimera, a fire-breathing creature combining the features of a lion, goat, and serpent. The hybrid body made it a perfect symbol of disorder, familiar animals joined in a form that should not exist. Bellerophon's decisive advantage was Pegasus. Pindar later told how Athena appeared to the hero and provided a golden bridle, allowing him to master the winged horse. From above, Bellerophon could avoid the Chimera's direct attack and overcome it from a position no ordinary warrior could reach. Iobates then sent him against the Solymi, the Amazons, and finally an ambush of chosen fighters, but Bellerophon returned from every trial. The king eventually concluded that divine favor protected him, revealed the hidden message, and gave him a place within the royal family. Yet Bellerophon's story did not end with victory. Later tradition says that success convinced him he could fly Pegasus toward Olympus itself. The attempt failed, and he spent his remaining years separated from the greatness he had once known, while Pegasus continued upward and entered the service of Zeus. The contrast with Perseus is deliberate even if no single poet designed both stories together. Perseus repeatedly depended on guidance and returned divine gifts when the task was finished. Bellerophon began with similar assistance, but eventually mistook access to divine power for equality with the gods. Around these heroes, wider family lines were taking shape. Europa's journey from the Phoenician coast to Crete connected her descendants with Minos, while her brother Cadmus became linked to the founding of Thebes. Greek tradition credited Cadmus with bringing letters from Phoenicia, and history does show that the Greek alphabet was adapted largely from Phoenician models around the 8th century BCE. That evidence does not prove Cadmus was a historical inventor. It suggests that his myth gave a human face to a real cultural connection remembered without precise dates. In the same way, the archaeological civilization modern scholars call Minoan was named after the legendary Minos, not discovered with proof that a king of that name had ruled Crete. Mythic families acted like bridges laid across fragments of the ancient world, joining Argos, Corinth, Thebes, Crete, Anatolia, and the eastern Mediterranean into one enormous remembered landscape. From Perseus's descendants would soon come Heracles, while the royal traditions of Crete and Athens would converge around Theseus. The first heroes had opened the roads, crossed the seas, and shown that monsters could be defeated. But they had also revealed a more enduring danger. Once a mortal survived the impossible, the hardest task was remembering that he was still mortal. Heracles entered Greek mythology carrying a contradiction that never left him. He possessed strength beyond ordinary mortals, yet the hardest forces in his life could not be defeated by strength alone. Born into the royal line of Perseus, he was the son of Alcmene and Zeus, though Alcmene's husband Amphitryon raised him within the human world. The Greeks called him Heracles, meaning something close to the glory of Hera, an ironic name because Hera's hostility followed him from birth. The Roman form Hercules would later become more familiar across much of Europe, but the Greek stories belonged to many different cities and centuries before Roman writers reshaped them. Even as an infant, Heracles was said to have overcome serpents sent against him, an early sign that his body placed him outside normal human limits. He grew into a warrior, helped defend Thebes, and married the king's daughter Megara. Then came the event that gave his strength a purpose he had never chosen. A divinely induced madness led to a catastrophe within his family, and when clarity returned, victory in battle no longer mattered. Seeking purification and direction, Heracles consulted the oracle at Delphi and was ordered to serve Eurystheus, king of Mycenae, a man who held authority despite being far less capable than the hero commanded to obey him. That imbalance is central to the story. Heracles could move stones, defeat beasts, and cross the boundaries of the known world, but he could not simply declare himself free from guilt or obligation. The tasks imposed by Eurystheus became the famous labors of Heracles. Early traditions did not always agree on their number or order. The familiar cycle of 12 developed from 10 original assignments after Eurystheus refused to count 2 of them, one because Heracles received help and another because payment had been involved. The cycle, therefore, feels less like a single adventure written at one moment than a collection of regional myths gathered around one extraordinary figure. His first labor took him to Nemea, where a lion with an impenetrable hide controlled the countryside. Ordinary weapons were useless, so Heracles overcame it at close range and afterward wore its skin as armor, giving Greek artists the unmistakable image of a bearded hero beneath a lion's head. At Lerna he faced the Hydra, a many-headed serpent associated with marshland and poisonous danger. Each time one head was removed, more threatened to appear, forcing Heracles to work with his nephew Aeolus to stop the creature from renewing itself. Eurystheus rejected the labor because of that assistance, but the episode exposes an important limit hidden beneath heroic pride. Even the strongest hero sometimes survives only because someone stands beside him. Other tasks required control rather than destruction. Heracles pursued the sacred Charanean hind without seriously harming it and captured the Erymanthian boar alive. He redirected rivers through the neglected stables of King Augeas, solving a seemingly impossible problem through engineering rather than muscle. He frightened away the dangerous birds of Lake Stymphalus with noise and divine assistance, then captured the Cretan bull, an animal that connected his story with the troubled royal traditions of Crete. As the labors continued, the geography expanded. Heracles brought back the dangerous mares of Diomedes in Thrace, obtained the belt of the Amazon queen Hippolyta, and traveled west to acquire the cattle of Geryon, a powerful figure imagined at the edge of the known world. To reach that distant region, Heracles became associated with the great promontories at the entrance to the Atlantic, later called the Pillars of Heracles. The story transformed a real geographical threshold, the Strait of Gibraltar, into a monument left by a hero, marking the point where the familiar Mediterranean opened toward an ocean few Greeks knew directly. His final assignments pushed beyond ordinary geography altogether. He sought the golden apples of the Hesperides, a task involving Atlas and the far western garden of the gods, and then descended into the underworld to bring Cerberus to the surface without using conventional weapons. By returning alive, Heracles crossed the boundary that defined every mortal life, though he did not erase it. His labors mapped a progression from nearby hills and marshes to foreign kingdoms, the ends of the earth, and finally, the realm of the dead. Looked at this way, the monsters were more than creatures waiting to be defeated. They occupied roads, caves, forests, wetlands, and distant coastlines, places beyond the security of fields and city walls. Heracles made those spaces imaginable and, in mythic terms, passable. This is why he became a pan-Hellenic hero rather than the possession of one city. Communities across the Greek world attached local landmarks, cults, and stories to him, while ruling families known as the Heraclids claimed descent from his children to strengthen their political legitimacy. Archaeology cannot verify that one historical man completed these labors. What it can show is that images of Heracles appeared widely in Greek art from the early 1st millennium BCE onward, and that his worship spread through sanctuaries and settlements across the Mediterranean. His myth grew as Greek travel and colonization grew, carrying a familiar hero into unfamiliar landscapes. Yet conquest did not bring him lasting peace. Later adventures included service to other rulers, participation in wars, and encounters in which his impatience caused new problems. When his mortal life finally ended, tradition separated his human and divine sides. The mortal Heracles passed from the world, while his divine nature was welcomed onto Olympus. The man forced to labor beneath a weaker king became a god, but only after learning that power could not protect anyone from consequence. If Heracles represented the clearing of a wild world on an enormous scale, Theseus performed a similar role for Athens by making one dangerous road into the foundation of a political identity. Theseus grew up in treason with his mother Aethra, while his father was usually identified as Aegeus, king of Athens, though some traditions also gave him divine descent from Poseidon. Before leaving, Aegeus placed a sword and sandals beneath a heavy stone, instructing Aethra that their son should recover them when strong enough and bring them to Athens as proof of his identity. When Theseus reached adulthood, he lifted the stone and chose to travel by land rather than take the safer route by sea. The road around the Saronic Gulf had become a chain of local dangers. Periphetes, Sinis, the Crommyonian Sow, Sciron, Cherson, and Procrustes each controlled part of the journey, attacking travelers or imposing brutal rules upon them. Theseus defeated them one by one, often turning their own methods against them. The pattern resembles the labors of Heracles, and that resemblance was probably intentional. As Athens rose in power, especially during the 6th and 5th centuries BCE, its storytellers developed Theseus into a civic counterpart to the older Pan-Hellenic hero. Heracles ranged across the world. Theseus cleared the road to Athens. Heracles conquered monsters at the edges of civilization. Theseus removed those who made human travel and exchange impossible. When Theseus reached Athens, Aegeus did not immediately recognize him. Medea, then living at the Athenian court in some versions, understood who the newcomer was and viewed him as a threat. A plot against Theseus failed when Aegeus recognized the sword the young man carried and publicly accepted him as his son. But the greatest test of Theseus lay across the sea in Crete. Athens was compelled to send a recurring tribute of young people to King Minos, where they entered the labyrinth built by Daedalus and faced the Minotaur, a creature with a human body and a bull's head. The tribute transformed political submission into a terrifying ritual, and Theseus volunteered to go with the next group, promising to end it. On Crete, Minos's daughter Ariadne gave him a thread so he could mark his path through the labyrinth. Theseus defeated the Minotaur, followed the thread back through the darkness, and escaped with the Athenians. The famous thread matters as much as the victory. The labyrinth could not be mastered through force because its true weapon was confusion. Theseus survived by preserving a connection to the entrance, a simple solution that turned an impossible structure into a path that could be reversed. The fate of Ariadne varies sharply between sources. Some say Theseus left her on the island of Naxos. Others imply that the god Dionysus claimed her for a different destiny. On the voyage home, Theseus failed to replace the ship's black sail with the white sail that would announce success. Achilles saw the dark sail, believed the mission had failed, and died before Theseus reached Athens. The returning hero therefore inherited a kingdom at the very moment of his greatest triumph, but the victory was permanently marked by an avoidable mistake. Later Athenian tradition credited Theseus with uniting the scattered communities of Attica into one political center, a process known as synocism. Historians do not regard this as proof that a single heroic king created Athens. The unification of Attica was probably gradual, shaped by settlement patterns, religious institutions, alliances, and political power. Theseus gave that long and complicated development a memorable human face. His ship was reportedly preserved by the Athenians for centuries as old planks were replaced, eventually inspiring the philosophical question of whether an object remains the same when every part has changed. His later life became less triumphant, filled with reckless alliances, failed expeditions, and a growing distance from the city he represented. Like Heracles, he could defeat external dangers more easily than he could control the consequences of his own choices. Together, the two heroes reveal what conquering the wilderness meant to Greek imagination. It was not merely killing monsters, it meant opening roads, defining borders, connecting distant regions, and creating stories through which communities explained why their world felt ordered. But that order remained fragile, and no hero could establish it alone. Soon a call would travel across Greece for the greatest figures of the age to gather aboard a single ship. Heracles would appear in many lists, alongside Orpheus, Castor, Pollux, Peleus, Telamon, and other names whose children would later fight at Troy. Their destination was Colchis, their prize was a golden fleece, and their voyage would become the first great expedition to unite the heroic world. Jason's journey began with a missing sandal and a king who had spent years fearing the stranger who would wear it. Peleus had taken control of Iolcus in Thessaly from Jason's family, while the young heir was raised away from court, often under the care of the wise centaur Chiron in later tradition. An oracle warned Peleus to beware a man wearing only one sandal. When Jason returned to claim his inheritance, he reached the flooded river Anaurus and helped an old woman cross, not realizing that she was the goddess Hera in disguise. One sandal was lost in the current, and Jason entered Iolcus wearing the exact sign Peleus feared. The king did not arrest him immediately. Instead, he asked what punishment Jason would choose for a man destined to overthrow his ruler. Jason answered that he would send such a man to retrieve the golden fleece, and Peleus seized upon the suggestion. If Jason refused, he would appear unworthy of the throne. If he accepted, the journey would probably remove him forever. The fleece lay far to the east in Colchis, on the coast of the Black Sea, and its own history reached back to another endangered royal family. Phrixus and his sister Hele had escaped on a flying ram with golden wool. Hele was lost while crossing the narrow waterway later called the Hellespont, but Phrixus reached Colchis, where King Aeetes welcomed him. The ram was offered in sacrifice, and its fleece was hung in a sacred grove under the protection of a sleepless serpent or dragon. Peleus had therefore chosen a prize located beyond difficult seas, defended by a powerful king, and guarded by something no ordinary traveler could approach. Jason's first achievement was not defeating that guardian, but building a community capable of reaching it. The shipwright Argus constructed the Argo with assistance from Athena, and one tradition placed a piece of prophetic oak from the sanctuary of Zeus at Dodona within its prow. The ship was more than transportation. It could advise, warn, and carry the fame of everyone aboard, while its name linked vessel and builder so closely that even ancient authors debated which came first. The crew became known as the Argonauts, yet no surviving source gives one final, universally accepted list. The most complete version comes from Apollonius of Rhodes, writing the Argonautica in the 3rd century BCE, long after the heroic age was imagined to have ended. Earlier poets, including Homer and Pindar, already knew parts of the voyage, proving that the story had circulated for centuries before Apollonius shaped it into a continuous epic. The shifting crew lists reveal how the myth expanded. Every region wanted its hero on the most famous ship ever launched. Orpheus came with music powerful enough to impose order on wind, water, and frightened men. Castor and Pollux brought different forms of skill, one renowned for horses and the other for boxing. Peleus and Telamon carried family lines that would later produce Achilles and Ajax. The winged brothers Zeus and Calais represented the reach of the north wind. Atalanta appears in some lists but is excluded from others. Heracles joins the expedition in many traditions, though his presence creates an obvious problem. A hero as dominant as Heracles would make it difficult for Jason to remain the center of his own story. The voyage solves that problem by leaving Heracles behind after his young companion Hylas disappears during a stop on the coast of Asia Minor. The Argo sails on without its strongest passenger, and Jason is forced to lead through judgment, negotiation, and the ability to keep greater personalities moving toward one goal. The route to Colchis transformed the map into a chain of tests. At the land of the Bebrycians, their king Amycus demanded that visitors face him in a boxing match until Pollux defeated him. Farther east, the Argonauts encountered the blind seer Phineus, tormented by the Harpies, who descended whenever food was placed before him. Zeus and Calais drove the creatures away, and the grateful prophet revealed how the ship could pass through the Symplegades, the clashing rocks that crushed anything caught between them. Phineus advised the crew to release a dove first. If the bird passed through, they should row with all their strength before the rocks closed again. The dove survived, with only the loss of a few feathers, and the Argo followed, escaping with minor damage to its stern. After the ship passed, the rocks became fixed, as though the successful crossing had converted a supernatural barrier into an ordinary geographical gateway. To audiences familiar with sailing, the episode captured the terror of entering a narrow strait where currents, winds, hidden rocks, and limited visibility could destroy a vessel without warning. It may preserve a poetic memory of early Greek exploration toward the Black Sea, but there is no evidence that one historical Argo completed the exact route. Greek sailors established settlements around the Black Sea during the first millennium BCE, and the myth allowed later communities to imagine that their heroes had crossed those waters before colonists and merchants arrived. Colchis itself was not a fantasy location. It corresponds broadly to a real region in what is now western Georgia, an area with ancient traditions of mining, metalworking, and exchange. Some scholars and local traditions have connected the Golden Fleece with a method of collecting particles of gold from streams by placing sheep fleeces in flowing water. The idea is possible and visually compelling, but it remains a hypothesis rather than a proven origin of the myth. Gold also worked perfectly as a symbol of kingship, divine favor, and an object valuable enough to justify crossing the known world. When Jason arrived at the court of Aeetes, he did not receive the fleece simply because he had survived the voyage. The king assigned him tasks designed to be impossible. Jason had to control fire-breathing bulls with bronze hooves, use them to plow a field, sow the teeth of a dragon, and survive the armed warriors who rose from the ground. Only then could he approach the guardian of the fleece. His success depended on Medea, daughter of Aeetes and a powerful figure associated with magic and the goddess Hecate. Under the influence of Aphrodite and Eros in the poetic tradition, Medea chose to help the foreign hero and made him promise loyalty to her. She provided a protective substance that allowed him to withstand the bulls, then instructed him to throw a stone among the earthborn warriors. Unable to identify who had attacked them, they turned against one another, allowing Jason to complete the task without confronting the entire group directly. Aeetes still refused to surrender the prize, revealing that the contest had never been fair. Medea then helped Jason reach the sacred grove and quiet the sleepless guardian. Jason removed the golden fleece from the tree, and the image must have seemed almost unreal. Gold shining in the darkness while the Argo waited at the river and the king's forces prepared to pursue. Yet the moment of triumph also marked the beginning of the expedition's moral decline. Medea had abandoned her father and homeland, while the escape brought a grave family tragedy involving her brother, told in sharply different ways by ancient sources. Some placed the event near Colchis, others much later along the route home, evidence that storytellers changed geography to solve problems inherited from older versions. The return voyage became even less consistent than the outward journey. Different poets sent the Argo through the Danube, the Adriatic, the Western Mediterranean, North Africa, or rivers no real ship could have used to connect those regions. These impossible routes were not careful navigation charts. They were attempts to gather distant landscapes into one heroic map. Islands, rivers, deserts, and coastlines could all claim that the Argo had passed nearby. Orpheus used his music to protect the crew from the Song of the Sirens, while Medea's knowledge helped them survive Talos, the bronze guardian of Crete. By the time the ship returned to Greece, the expedition had crossed not one coherent sea route, but the collected imagination of the Mediterranean world. Jason arrived at Iolcus carrying the fleece, proving that Peleus's impossible demand had failed, but possession of the prize did not restore order. The attempt to remove Peleus ended through a deadly act of deception arranged by Medea, and Jason and Medea were eventually forced into exile. Their later life at Corinth became the subject of Euripides' tragedy Medea, first performed in 431 BCE. In that version, Jason abandons his promises in pursuit of a politically useful marriage, and the family collapses into catastrophe. Euripides did not invent every part of the story, but his play became so influential that later audiences often treated his arrangement as the standard ending. Jason's rise and fall reveal why he is unlike Heracles or Perseus. He does not possess overwhelming strength or a flawless divine weapon. His greatness comes from bringing exceptional people together and persuading Medea to make his success possible. Once he breaks the relationships supporting him, the Golden Fleece cannot save him. The same generation gathered again in another great shared adventure, the Caledonian boar hunt. King Aeneas of Caledon had failed to honor Artemis in a sacrifice, and the goddess sent an enormous boar to devastate the region. Aeneas called heroes from across Greece, including Meleager, Atalanta, Castor, Pollux, Peleus, Telamon, and several figures found in Argonautic lists. Atalanta was the first to wound the animal, and Meleager delivered the final strike before awarding her the hide. The decision provoked a dispute among hunters unwilling to accept a woman's claim to the honor, and the victory dissolved into another family tragedy. The expedition had begun as a defense of farmland against wilderness, but pride proved more destructive than the creature they had gathered to defeat. By now, the pattern was becoming impossible to miss. The great heroes could cross unknown seas and overcome monstrous threats, yet every triumph exposed rivalries within the group that achieved it. Peleus and Telamon would carry those memories into the families of Achilles and Ajax. Castor and Pollux belonged to the same Spartan household as Helen, whose future would draw kings from across Greece into war, and while the Argo's crew was dispersing, the royal houses of Thebes and Mycenae were moving toward disasters no ship could escape. The heroic world had learned how to unite for a quest. It had not yet learned how to survive its own families. Thebes did not fall because one enemy discovered a weakness in its walls. It was weakened from within by a family that treated prophecy as something to outmaneuver, even when every attempt to escape it narrowed the road toward fulfillment. The royal line descended through Labdacus to his son Laius, who inherited the throne of Thebes and a warning from the oracle. If he fathered a son, that child would one day kill him and marry his own mother. Ancient sources do not agree on why the prophecy existed. Later writers connected it with an earlier violation of hospitality committed by Laius, while others treated it simply as a fate imposed without explanation. That uncertainty changes how the story feels. If the family was being punished, the disaster could be understood as justice moving across generations. If no reason existed, then the myth became more disturbing, suggesting that suffering might begin before anyone involved had knowingly earned it. Laius and Queen Jocasta eventually had a son, then tried to prevent the oracle by having the infant abandoned on Mount Cithaeron. Marks left on the child's ankles contributed to the name Oedipus, commonly understood as swollen foot. Yet the servant entrusted with the task spared him, and another shepherd carried the child to Corinth, where King Polybus and Queen Merope raised him as their own. Oedipus grew up believing he was a Corinthian prince. His life might have remained there if a rumor about his parentage had not unsettled him. When Polybus and Merope refused to confirm the accusation, Oedipus traveled to Delphi and asked Apollo's oracle who his parents truly were. The oracle did not answer that question. Instead, it gave him the same terrifying future Laius had heard. Oedipus would kill his father and marry his mother. Believing Polybus and Merope were the people in danger, he refused to return to Corinth. The decision seemed honorable, even loving, but it was based on incomplete knowledge. At a narrow crossroads, Oedipus encountered an older nobleman traveling with attendants. Neither side yielded. A confrontation followed, and Oedipus killed the stranger without knowing he was Laius, king of Thebes, and his biological father. The crossroads was not merely a convenient setting. In Greek imagination, roads were places where identity became uncertain and social rules weakened. A traveler might be a king, a god, an exile, or an enemy, and there was no city court nearby to establish the truth. Oedipus made a rapid judgment in a place designed for mistaken judgments, then continued toward the city whose throne had just become empty. Thebes was being terrorized by the Sphinx, a creature usually shown with a lion's body, wings, and a human head. She prevented passage by posing a riddle. What creature walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 at midday, and 3 in the evening? Oedipus answered that the creature was humanity, crawling in infancy, walking upright in adulthood, and using a staff in old age. The Sphinx was defeated, the road reopened, and Thebes welcomed Oedipus as a savior. He received the vacant kingship and married the widowed queen Jocasta. Neither understood that the oracle had already been fulfilled. Their children, Eteocles, Polynices, Antigone, and Ismene, were born into a household whose public success rested on a hidden truth. The hero who solved the riddle of human life could not yet solve the mystery of his own. Years later, a plague struck Thebes. Crops failed, families suffered, and the city turned again to the ruler whose intelligence had once saved it. The oracle declared that the pollution caused by Laius's unsolved death had to be removed. Oedipus promised to find the former king's killer, launching an investigation that forms the structure of Sophocles' Oedipus the King. First performed in 5th century BCE Athens, the play was written centuries after the legendary age in which it is set. Sophocles did not create the entire Oedipus tradition, and other ancient versions differed on important details, but he transformed the myth into something remarkably close to a detective story. Each witness provides another fragment: the blind prophet Tiresias, Jocasta's memories, news from Corinth, and finally the surviving shepherd who knows what happened to the abandoned infant. Oedipus drives the inquiry forward even when those around him beg him to stop. His intelligence is not the opposite of his downfall. It is the instrument that makes the final discovery unavoidable. He learns that Polybus and Merope were not his biological parents, that the stranger at the crossroads was Laius, and that Jocasta was both his wife and his mother. The household collapses beneath the revelation. Jocasta dies, Oedipus relinquishes his authority, and the man who once opened the road into Thebes leaves the city as an exile. Later tradition carried him to Colonus, near Athens, where his final resting place became a source of sacred protection. The myth, therefore, does not end by reducing Oedipus to a criminal who knowingly chose forbidden acts. He spent his life trying to avoid them. Its deeper tension lies between responsibility and knowledge. How should a person be judged when actions are real, consequences are devastating, but the truth was hidden at the moment of choice? Modern psychology later borrowed Oedipus's name for a theory that does not capture the full meaning of the ancient story. For Greek audiences, the central concerns were fate, identity, kingship, ritual pollution, and the limits of human understanding. No historical evidence proves that Oedipus ruled Thebes, but the city itself was a major Mycenaean center. Excavations on the Cadmea, the fortified hill at the heart of Thebes, have revealed palace structures, valuable objects, and linear B tablets from the late Bronze Age. The tablets record administrators, goods, land, animals, and offerings, rather than the story of Oedipus. They confirm that a powerful palace society existed where later Greeks located the myth, while leaving the royal family in the realm of tradition. After Oedipus departed, his sons inherited not a stable kingdom but a dispute over who had the right to rule it. Eteocles and Polynices were said to have agreed to alternate the throne, but Eteocles remained in power when his term ended. Polynices went into exile at Argos and sought help from King Adrastus, gathering a coalition remembered as the Seven Against Thebes. The standard list includes Adrastus, Polynices, Tydeus, Capaneus, Hippomedon, Parthenopaeus, and the reluctant seer Amphiaraus, though ancient sources vary. Each commander approached one of Thebes' 7 gates, turning the city's defenses into a stage where 7 ambitions met 7 barriers. The assault failed. Eteocles and Polynices died fighting one another, leaving their uncle Creon to govern a city that had survived the siege but lost its ruling brothers. Creon honored Eteocles as defender of Thebes and denied burial to Polynices as an attacker. Antigone resisted his command, arguing through her actions that obligations to family and the gods stood above the decree of a ruler. Sophocles' Antigone made that conflict famous, but it offers no easy division between a completely righteous individual and a completely irrational state. Creon fears that honoring a rebel will weaken civic authority. Antigone fears that obeying the city will violate a law older than any government. Both treat compromise as betrayal, and Thebes pays for their certainty. The story remained powerful in Athens because its audience lived in a society continually debating where family loyalty ended and public duty began. The Seven had failed, but their children did not accept the defeat. A generation later, the Epigoni, the descendants of the original commanders, returned to Thebes. This time the attackers succeeded, completing a pattern that Greek mythology repeatedly used. Fathers begin a conflict, and children inherit the obligation to finish it. The Theban Wars once formed a major epic tradition alongside the Trojan cycle, but most of the poems devoted to them have been lost. We know them through fragments, brief references in Homer, later mythographers, vase paintings, and surviving Athenian tragedies. Their disappearance distorts modern understanding. Troy now seems like the only great war of the heroic age, partly because the Iliad survived while the Theban epics did not. To the ancient Greeks, Thebes belonged to an equally deep landscape of sieges, exiles, and broken dynasties. The same generational pressure was building at Mycenae within the house of Pelops. Pelops gave his name to the Peloponnese and became associated with royal power and the early traditions of the Olympic Games. But his descendants, Atreus and Thyestes, turned succession into a bitter family struggle. Their rivalry involved disputed kingship, deception, and an act of revenge so extreme that later poets treated it as a stain spreading through the dynasty. The sons of Atreus, Agamemnon and Menelaus, inherited far more than palaces. They inherited a political world in which family loyalty could become a weapon, hospitality could be violated, and vengeance could claim the language of justice. Agamemnon became king of wealthy Mycenae, while Menelaus ruled Sparta beside Helen, whose ancestry connected her to Zeus, and whose reputation had already attracted powerful men from across Greece. Archaeology shows that Mycenae was indeed a major palace center during the Late Bronze Age, with monumental fortifications, elite burials, and long-distance connections. It cannot identify Agamemnon or verify the curse of Atreus, but the ruins explain why later Greeks chose Mycenae as the home of a king capable of leading many regions to war. Thebes had demonstrated what happened when a royal family tried to govern through unresolved guilt. Mycenae was about to carry the same pattern onto an international stage. One marriage, one judgment among goddesses, and one contested journey across the Aegean would draw nearly every surviving heroic bloodline toward Troy. By then, the old family conflicts would no longer remain inside palace walls. They would become a war large enough to end the age that produced them. The Trojan War began, according to Greek tradition, not beneath the walls of Troy, but at a wedding where one guest had deliberately been excluded. The sea goddess Thetis had once attracted the attention of Zeus and Poseidon, but a prophecy warned that her son would become greater than his father. Neither god wished to create a future rival, so Thetis was married to the mortal hero Peleus. Their child would be Achilles, powerful enough to dominate a war, yet still bound by mortality. The wedding gathered gods and heroes in one place, but Eris, the goddess of discord, was not invited. She arrived with a golden apple marked for the fairest and cast it among Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite. Zeus refused to judge between them and assigned the decision to Paris, a prince of Troy living at that time as a shepherd on Mount Ida. Paris had been removed from the royal household as an infant after his mother Hecuba dreamed that her child would bring destruction upon Troy. A servant spared him. Shepherds raised him, and he eventually returned to the family whose future had been tied to his existence. When the three goddesses approached him, each offered a reward. Hera promised royal power, Athena offered victory and wisdom in war, and Aphrodite promised the most beautiful woman in the world. Paris chose Aphrodite, receiving her support and the lasting hostility of the other two. The judgment was more than a contest over beauty. It placed three possible foundations of civilization: political authority, military intelligence, and desire, before one young man, and he selected the reward whose consequences would be hardest to control. The woman promised to him was Helen of Sparta, daughter of Leda and usually Zeus, though some traditions named the goddess Nemesis as her mother. Helen was already married to Menelaus, king of Sparta. Before that marriage, rulers and heroes from across Greece had sought her hand, creating a dangerous problem for her earthly father Tyndareus. Choosing one husband could turn all the rejected suitors into enemies. Odysseus proposed a solution. Every suitor would swear to defend the chosen marriage against anyone who violated it. Menelaus was selected, and the oath transformed a private marriage into an agreement binding many kingdoms. Years later, Paris arrived in Sparta as a guest. Menelaus welcomed him according to Xenia, the sacred custom of hospitality protected by Zeus, then traveled away from the palace. Paris departed with Helen and wealth from the royal household, violating not only a marriage, but the relationship between host and guest. Ancient sources never agreed completely on Helen's role. Homer often presents her as remorseful and trapped within the consequences of the gods' decisions. Other traditions suggest she chose to leave with Paris, while still others insist she never reached Troy at all. The poet Stesichorus was credited with a version in which a phantom went to Troy, while the real Helen remained in Egypt, an idea later dramatized by Euripides. Herodotus also placed Helen in Egypt, though through a different narrative. These alternatives reveal that Greek audiences were uncomfortable with making one woman solely responsible for a war involving entire states. Helen could be a willing participant, a captive, a divine illusion, or a symbol onto whom male rulers projected their ambitions. Whatever version was told, Menelaus returned to an empty palace and called upon the oath. His brother Agamemnon, king of Mycenae, took command of the expedition. Homer usually calls the coalition Achaeans, Danaans, or Argives rather than Greeks, because a unified Greek nation did not exist in the heroic world or in Homer's own period. The army was imagined as an alliance of separate kingdoms: Mycenae, Sparta, Pylos, Ithaca, Salamis, Crete, and many others, each led by its own ruler and held together by obligation, honor, and the promise of wealth. Not every hero wished to join. Odysseus, now king of Ithaca and father of a young son, attempted to avoid the expedition by pretending to have lost his reason, but Palamedes exposed the deception. Achilles was hidden on the island of Skyros in an effort to keep him from the war destiny predicted for him. Odysseus discovered him by presenting gifts among which weapons had been placed. When a sudden alarm sounded, Achilles instinctively reached for them and revealed himself. These recruitment stories show that later tradition understood the cost before the fleet ever sailed. The greatest heroes did not march toward Troy because all of them desired war. Some were trapped by oaths, some by reputation, and some by the knowledge that refusing would define them as surely as going. The coalition gathered at Aulis, a harbor in Boeotia, but the winds would not carry the ships across the Aegean. The seer Calchas declared that Artemis was angry with Agamemnon and demanded his daughter Iphigenia as an offering. The sources divide over what followed. In some versions, Iphigenia died at Aulis. In others, Artemis replaced her with a deer and carried her to a distant sanctuary. Euripides used the uncertainty to expose the moral contradiction at the center of the expedition. Agamemnon claimed to defend a brother's marriage, yet his leadership placed his own household in danger before the first battle. When the fleet finally sailed, it did not move with perfect knowledge. One tradition says the Greeks first landed mistakenly in Mysia, where they fought King Telephus before learning the correct route. The episode may reflect how distant and uncertain Troy appeared to storytellers, separated from the imagined war by centuries. The expedition knew its enemy's name, but not always how to reach him. At Troy, the first Greek to step ashore was Prometheus, who immediately fulfilled a prophecy that the first man to land would be the first lost. The rest established their camp along the shore, while Troy remained protected by formidable walls. Tradition turned the conflict into a 10-year siege, but for much of that time the Greeks raided neighboring towns and islands rather than attacking the city continuously. Those campaigns supplied food, treasure, and captives, including Chryseis and Perseus, whose presence would later trigger the dispute at the center of the Iliad. The war became an economy as much as a battlefield. Thousands of men gathered far from home had to be fed, rewarded, and kept loyal, while commanders measured status through prizes taken during raids. Beneath the mythic language, that detail resembles what historians understand about many Bronze Age conflicts. Warfare could combine dynastic rivalry, raiding, control of trade routes, and the pursuit of portable wealth. Troy itself was real. The site now identified with ancient Troy stands at Hisarlik in northwestern Turkey, near the entrance to the Dardanelles. Its location allowed it to watch an important corridor between the Aegean and the Black Sea. Archaeologists have uncovered multiple cities built one above another, conventionally labeled Troy I through Troy IX, with many additional phases inside those layers. The question is not whether a substantial settlement existed there, but which destruction, if any, contributed to the later war tradition. Troy VI, a prosperous city with impressive sloping walls and towers, suffered major destruction around the end of the 13th century BCE, perhaps largely from an earthquake, though the cause remains debated. Troy VII reused the defenses and shows signs of crowded occupation before being destroyed around the late 13th or early 12th century BCE. Evidence of fire and conflict has made it another candidate, but archaeology cannot tell us that Agamemnon ordered the attack, or that Helen stood inside the walls. No layer contains a label reading, "The City of Priam." The most intriguing written evidence comes not from Greece, but from Hittite archives in Anatolia. Hittite texts mention a western land called Vilusa, widely considered a plausible linguistic match for Ilios, another Greek name for Troy. They also refer to Ahiawa, which many scholars connect with the Achaeans, or a Mycenaean Greek power. A treaty names a ruler called Alexandru of Vilusa, a name that resembles Alexandros, the alternate name of Paris. These connections are suggestive, but they are not a direct record of Homer's war. The documents describe diplomacy, rebellion, disputed territories, and competition among real late Bronze Age states. They show that Western Anatolia was politically unstable and that powers linked with the Aegean operated there. A conflict involving Wilusa and forces from across the sea is historically possible, perhaps even likely at some point. But the 10-year war of epic may combine several events into one enormous remembered struggle. The traditional war is usually placed somewhere around the 13th or early 12th century BCE, near the broader collapse of palace societies across the eastern Mediterranean. Mycenaean centers such as Pylos, Tiryns, and Mycenae suffered destruction or major decline around 1200 BCE. Trade networks fractured, populations shifted, and linear bee administration disappeared. Homeric poetry took shape in its surviving form centuries later, probably during the 8th century BCE, after generations of oral performance. That long gap allowed authentic memories of Bronze Age places, objects, and political geography to mix with features from later Greek society. The Iliad is therefore neither straightforward history nor pure invention. It is a layered work in which fragments of a lost age survived inside poetry shaped for a new one. By the 9th year of the siege, both armies had reasons to continue that went far beyond Helen. Troy was defending its city, families, allies, and independence. The Achaeans had invested years, lives, and reputations in an expedition that could no longer return empty-handed without humiliation. The gods themselves divided their support. Hera and Athena opposed Troy because of Paris's judgment, while Aphrodite protected Paris, Apollo favored the Trojans, and Zeus attempted to balance promises that could not all be honored. Then a priest named Chryses entered the Greek camp and asked Agamemnon to return his captive daughter. Agamemnon refused, Apollo sent a plague through the army, and Achilles called an assembly to confront the crisis. After nearly a decade of war, the event that nearly destroyed the Greek coalition was not an attack from Troy. It was an argument between its most powerful king and its greatest warrior. Achilles entered the assembly not to demand glory, but to discover why men were dying inside their own camp. The seer Calchas explained that Apollo's plague would end only if Agamemnon returned Chryseis to her father without payment. Agamemnon agreed, but he refused to lose the captive woman who represented his share of the campaign's rewards. He demanded Briseis, the prize awarded to Achilles, and by taking her he publicly declared that a king's authority mattered more than a warrior's achievement. To a modern audience, the dispute can seem disturbingly focused on possession, and the poem never asks us to forget that both women had been taken during war. Yet within the honor system of the Iliad, the immediate conflict concerns status. Prizes were visible proof of rank, and removing one before the army meant erasing the honor attached to it. Achilles reached for his weapon, but Athena restrained him, and he chose a different form of resistance. He withdrew from the fighting. Agamemnon would keep the army, the ships, and the title of commander, but he would have to learn how little those things meant without the warrior who made victory possible. Achilles then asked his mother Thetis to persuade Zeus to favor Troy until the Achaeans recognized what they had lost. The request is severe because it places personal honor above the survival of comrades, but the Iliad does not build Achilles as a simple model of virtue. It studies what happens when an exceptional person lives inside a system that praises him as indispensable while treating him as replaceable. Zeus begins shifting the battle toward the Trojans. Agamemnon receives a deceptive dream promising success, leads his forces out, and discovers that confidence cannot substitute for Achilles. Paris faces Menelaus in single combat, but divine intervention prevents the duel from ending the war. Diomedes achieves a brilliant day of battle and even confronts gods who have entered the fighting, yet no temporary success changes the larger direction. Hector becomes the force holding Troy together. Unlike Achilles, whose identity is tied to personal glory, Hector fights within a network of duties, as son of Priam, husband of Andromache, father, prince, and defender of a city filled with people who cannot simply sail away. His private fear never removes his public responsibility. When he meets Andromache near the walls, both understand what Troy's fall would mean. But Hector returns to battle because withdrawing would force others to bear the danger in his place. This makes him the emotional opposite of Achilles, though neither man can escape the expectations built around him. As the Trojans drive the Achaeans back toward their ships, Agamemnon finally offers Achilles wealth, gifts, and the return of Briseis. Odysseus, Ajax, and Phoenix carry the proposal to his shelter. Achilles refuses. The offer attempts to restore his honor without admitting that the original act was wrong, and he has begun questioning the entire economy of heroic fame. A brave fighter and a cautious man eventually meet the same death. Treasure cannot repay a life. Glory survives only as a story told by people who were never present. Achilles knows he faces two possible destinies: remain at Troy, die young, and gain everlasting fame, or return home, live longer, and disappear from epic memory. The Iliad draws its power from the fact that he sees the trap clearly and still cannot step outside it. With Achilles absent, Hector breaks through the Greek defenses and reaches the ships. Patroclus, Achilles' closest companion, can no longer watch the army collapse. He asks permission to wear Achilles' armor, hoping the sight alone will convince the Trojans that the great warrior has returned. Achilles agrees, but orders him to drive the enemy away from the ships and then come back. The plan works too well. Patroclus pushes the Trojans across the plain, continues beyond the agreed limit, and is eventually killed after Apollo, the warrior Euphorbus, and Hector each play a part. Hector takes the famous armor, believing he has captured the visible power of Achilles. But armor can transfer appearance, not identity, and Patroclus' death changes the meaning of the entire war. Achilles' anger had been directed at Agamemnon. Now it turns toward Hector and, more painfully, toward himself. He had asked Zeus to let the Achaeans suffer so they would value him, but he never imagined that the suffering would reach the person he valued most. Thetis knows that returning to battle will bring her son closer to his own death, yet she goes to Hephaestus and obtains new armor. The shield he creates is one of the Iliad's most remarkable images. Upon it are cities at peace and at war, fields being harvested, vineyards, herds, dances, legal disputes, stars, ocean, and the full rhythm of human life. Achilles carries an entire world into battle, including everything the battlefield threatens to erase. Reconciled with Agamemnon, but not truly healed, he returns to the plain and drives the Trojans behind their walls. Hector remains outside, first debating whether to face him, and then realizing that retreat can no longer save his honor. Achilles defeats Hector and refuses at first to treat the fallen prince with the rites normally owed to the dead. Rage has made victory insufficient. He wants grief itself to continue. The gods preserve Hector's dignity, and the story finally turns away from combat toward one of its quietest and most human scenes. Prion, guided into the Achaean camp, enters Achilles' shelter and asks for his son's body. He appeals not to military law, but to memory, asking Achilles to think of his own aging father. For a moment, enemy identities fall away. Priam mourns Hector, Achilles mourns Patroclus and the father he will not see again, and both recognize that no victory can return what has been lost. Achilles accepts the ransom, returns Hector, and grants Troy time for funeral rites. The Iliad ends there, with Hector's burial, not with Achilles' death, the wooden horse, or the destruction of Troy. Its action covers only a short period, commonly calculated at about 51 days in the 10th year of the war. Everything that follows comes from other traditions. The fragmentary epic cycle, scenes in the Odyssey, lyric poetry, Athenian tragedy, later Greek mythographers, Roman authors, and ancient art. That distinction matters because modern retellings often compress centuries of storytelling into a single Homeric plot that Homer's surviving poem never contained. After Hector's death, new allies arrive for Troy. Penthesilea leads the Amazons, and Memnon, son of the dawn goddess Eos, comes with forces from the east. Both are formidable, but Achilles defeats them. His own end then arrives near the city, when Paris, aided by Apollo in many versions, shoots the fatal arrow. The famous idea that Achilles was invulnerable everywhere except his heel is not part of Homer's Iliad. Early epic treats him as an extraordinary but fully mortal warrior. The story of Thetis dipping him into the river Styx and leaving one vulnerable point appears much later. Achilles' heel became such a powerful metaphor that it now overshadows the older meaning of his death. No amount of excellence could cancel mortality. After his funeral, his armor becomes the subject of a contest between Ajax and Odysseus. Odysseus receives it, while the decision leads to Ajax's downfall and removes another of the Achaeans' greatest warriors. Troy still cannot be captured by force alone. Prophecies and captured information reveal additional conditions for victory. Philoctetes must return with the bow of Heracles, Neoptolemus, the son of Achilles, must be brought from Skyros, and the sacred Palladium protecting Troy must be removed. Philoctetes returns and Paris dies, but the walls remain standing. Odysseus then turns the war from siege into deception. The craftsman Epeius constructs an enormous wooden horse, hollow enough to conceal selected warriors. The rest of the army burns or abandons parts of the camp and sails out of sight toward Tenedos, leaving Chinon behind to persuade the Trojans that the horse is a sacred offering and that bringing it inside will protect their city. Cassandra warns that the gift conceals disaster, but her true prophecies are never believed. Laocoon also argues against accepting it, yet signs interpreted as divine judgment silence the opposition. The Trojans break an opening large enough to bring the horse within their walls and celebrate what appears to be the end of 10 years of war. No archaeological evidence confirms that such a machine existed. Scholars have proposed that the horse could preserve a memory of a siege engine, a ship, an earthquake symbol connected with Poseidon, or simply a brilliant fictional device. None of these explanations has achieved broad agreement. Within the myth, its importance is unmistakable. Troy falls when hope changes the meaning of evidence. The abandoned camp, departing ships, and wooden offering all seem to prove that the siege is over, so warnings begin to sound like an inability to accept good news. During the night, the hidden warriors emerge, open the gates, and signal the fleet to return. The city that had resisted open assault for a decade is overwhelmed from within. Priam's royal household is destroyed, survivors are scattered or taken captive, and sacred places are violated despite the gods' protection. The victory is therefore stained at the moment it is achieved. Greek art and drama repeatedly return to Troy's fall not simply as a celebration of Achaean cunning, but as a warning that success can become its own form of moral failure. Even the surviving details of weapons and armor carry that layered history. Homer remembers objects such as a boar's tusk helmet that archaeology confirms belonged to the Mycenaean Bronze Age, yet other customs in the poem reflect later centuries. The epic world is a mosaic of preserved memory and poetic reconstruction, not a transparent record of one campaign. At dawn, smoke rises above Troy, and the coalition prepares to divide its spoils and sail home. Agamemnon believes he has restored his family's honor. Menelaus has recovered Helen. Odysseus has helped win the war no spear could finish. But the gods have watched the arrogance, broken promises, and sacrilege surrounding the city's destruction. The voyage back will not be a simple reversal of the route to Troy. For some leaders it will last days, for others years, and for several it will never lead to the home they expect. Troy has fallen, but the age of heroes still has one final reckoning to deliver. The Greeks had crossed the Aegean as one great coalition, but they left Troy as scattered ships carrying different burdens home. Their return stories were known collectively as the Nostoi, or returns, and most of the epic poems devoted to them have been lost. What survives through Homer, fragments, drama, and later summaries, shows that victory did not restore the world that existed before the war. Nestor reached Pylos relatively quickly because he departed without joining the final disputes among the commanders. Menelaus and Helen wandered through Cyprus, Phoenicia, Egypt, and other regions before returning to Sparta, their long route reflecting both the geographic imagination of Greek sailors and real networks connecting the eastern Mediterranean. Agamemnon sailed toward Mycenae expecting the authority of a victorious king, but during his 10-year absence, Aegisthus had entered his household and formed an alliance with Queen Clytemnestra. Agamemnon returned with Cassandra, the Trojan prophet, whose warnings were never believed, and both were killed soon after reaching the palace. Homer's Odyssey gives a relatively simple version of the betrayal, while Aeschylus later transformed it into a complex drama about Iphigenia, war, marriage, kingship, and vengeance. Agamemnon's son Orestes eventually avenged his father, but the Furies pursued him for continuing the cycle of family bloodshed. In Aeschylus's Eumenides, that cycle is finally redirected into a public trial at Athens. The solution is not that the past disappears, it is that judgment moves from private revenge into a civic institution. Myth becomes a way of imagining how society might replace inherited violence with law. No returning hero, however, traveled a more famous road than Odysseus. The Odyssey opens almost 10 years after Troy has fallen, with its hero still absent from Ithaca. His palace is filled with suitors, consuming his livestock, competing to marry Penelope, and treating his disappearance as proof that his household no longer has a master. Penelope delays them through intelligence rather than force. She promises to choose a husband after completing a burial cloth for Odysseus's father, Laertes, then secretly reverses part of her work each night. Her son Telemachus has grown up surrounded by stories about a father he can barely remember. Guided by Athena, he visits Nestor at Pylos and Menelaus at Sparta, searching not only for information, but for a model of the adult he must become. Meanwhile, Odysseus is being held far from home on the island of Calypso. The gods finally order his release, and after another difficult crossing, he reaches the Phaeacians. There, speaking before a court that does not initially know his identity, he tells the story of his wandering. This structure matters. Most of the famous voyage is a story Odysseus tells about himself. He is both survivor and narrator, choosing how strangers will understand his failures, temptations, and victories. After leaving Troy, his men attack the Cicones, carrying the habits of war into a world where the war is already over. Their delay brings a costly response and establishes the pattern of the voyage. Danger grows when discipline fails. The Lotus Eaters offer a quieter threat. Their food does not defeat travelers through force, but through forgetfulness, making home feel no longer necessary. Odysseus pulls his companions back to the ships because the loss of purpose can end a journey as completely as a storm. On the island of the Cyclops, curiosity leads him into the cave of Polyphemus, a son of Poseidon. Odysseus saves his surviving men through language, identifying himself as nobody, so that when the wounded Cyclops calls for help, his neighbors misunderstand the danger. The Greeks escape beneath the animals leaving the cave, but Odysseus cannot resist announcing his real name from the departing ship. That single boast converts a successful escape into a lasting curse. Polyphemus asks Poseidon to prevent or delay his return, and the sea god becomes the great force opposing him. The episode reveals the divided nature of Odysseus's intelligence. His cleverness solves the immediate problem. His desire to receive credit creates the next one. Aeolus, keeper of the winds, later gives him a sealed bag containing every wind that could drive the ships away from Ithaca. Home comes within sight, but while Odysseus sleeps, his companions open the bag, believing it contains hidden treasure. The released winds carry them back across the sea. Their failure is not simple foolishness. After years of unequal rewards under warrior kings, they assume their leader is keeping wealth for himself. Mistrust destroys what navigation nearly accomplished. The Laestrygonians then overwhelm most of the fleet, leaving Odysseus with a single ship. On the island of Circe, some of his companions are transformed into animals, until Hermes helps Odysseus confront her power. Circe restores them, and later becomes an advisor, directing Odysseus toward the realm of the dead. There he consults the prophet Tiresias and encounters memories the war has left behind, including Agamemnon and Achilles. Achilles, once offered eternal fame in exchange for a short life, now speaks from a realm where glory has little practical value. The heroic promise that drove the war sounds different when heard after its price has been paid. Returning to the sea, Odysseus passes the Sirens, whose song promises knowledge to anyone who stops and listens. He survives, by placing control outside his own changing desire, acknowledging that intelligence sometimes means preparing for a moment when intelligence alone may fail. He then guides the ship between Scylla and Charybdis, a choice between dangers that cannot both be avoided. The surviving crew eventually reaches the island of Helios, where they have been strictly warned not to harm the sacred cattle. While Odysseus is absent, hunger and exhaustion overcome restraint. The cattle are taken, the ship is later destroyed, and Odysseus becomes the only survivor of the expedition. He reaches Calypso's island alone. The voyage has steadily removed the visible signs of his heroic identity, army, ships, companions, wealth, until only the man and his desire for home remain. The Phaeacians finally carry him asleep to Ithaca and leave him on the shore with gifts. Athena disguises him as a beggar so he can enter his own kingdom without revealing that the missing king has returned. This homecoming is the reverse of heroic warfare. At Troy, reputation made Odysseus powerful. In Ithaca, survival depends on hiding his name. He tests servants, studies the suitors, reunites with Telemachus, and learns who remained loyal during his absence. Penelope announces a contest involving Odysseus's bow, an object none of the suitors can properly use. The disguised stranger succeeds, reveals himself, and defeats the men who have occupied his household. Yet, recognition does not come through the bow alone. Penelope tests him by referring to their marriage bed as though it could be moved. Odysseus responds that the bed was built around a living olive tree rooted inside the house. Only the two of them understand that secret, and Penelope finally accepts that the man before her is not an impostor. The rooted bed provides the journey's quietest answer to years of wandering. Ships move, kingdoms fall, and identities can be hidden. But home is represented by something built around roots that cannot be carried away. The Odyssey does not end at the moment of recognition. The families of the defeated suitors prepare to continue the conflict, threatening Ithaca with another cycle of revenge. Athena intervenes and imposes peace, because returning home means little if the habits of war are allowed to rebuild the battlefield there. Later lost epics and regional traditions continued the lives of Odysseus and other survivors in different ways, but no single conclusion became as authoritative as the Odyssey's restoration of household and community. Attempts to map every island in the poem onto a precise modern location remain disputed. Ithaca is real, and Mediterranean landscapes may have inspired individual episodes, but the voyage combines geography with folktale, memory, and poetic invention. Its sea is both a recognizable environment and a space where every human weakness can become an island. Historically, the end of the heroic age may preserve a distant cultural memory of the transformation following the collapse of the late Bronze Age palace system around 1200 BCE. Major centers declined or were destroyed, linear B administration vanished, long-distance networks changed, and the political world became more fragmented. The legendary kings did not simply evolve into the rulers of classical Greece. Between them lay centuries during which stories traveled orally, changing with each performance. When the Iliad and Odyssey took their surviving forms, probably around the 8th century BCE, their audiences lived in a different society of emerging city-states, overseas settlements, sanctuaries, and alphabetic writing. They looked backward toward an age of enormous palaces and warriors who seemed closer to the gods, yet they also filled that age with questions from their own world. What makes a ruler legitimate? When does honor become destructive? Can intelligence defeat fate? How can justice end revenge rather than continue it? Hesiod placed the heroes between the violent Bronze Race and his own troubled Iron Age, making them a brilliant interruption in humanity's decline. Some reached the Isles of the Blessed. Others returned to homes permanently changed by absence. The gods did not vanish when the heroes disappeared. They continued to receive worship in temples, festivals, sacrifices, and household rituals for centuries. What ended was the imagined closeness between gods and mortals, the age when divine parents produced heroic children, gods entered battles in visible form, and one family's dispute could reshape the entire world. Greek mythology therefore closes without a final destruction of the cosmos. Olympus remains above, the underworld remains below, and ordinary human life continues between them. The last heroes leave behind ruins, bloodlines, sacred places, and stories. Those stories survive because the Greeks never reduced them to one official version. Poets, cities, artists, and worshippers kept asking new questions of the same ancient figures, allowing contradiction to become part of the tradition rather than a flaw within it. The chronological journey that began before the sky had separated from the earth ends not with silence, but with human voices remembering a world they believed had once been greater, stranger, and more dangerous than their own. From chaos to Olympus, Troy, and Odysseus's return, the age of gods and heroes has reached its end. Thank you for watching, and please subscribe to Sleepy Hidden History